Our overall goal, though, is unchanged, and that is to deliver quality content on Russian political military affairs from some of the brightest minds in the Russia Watcher community. Now, veterans of Project Connect may recall that these are unclassed briefings, of course, and especially for the Q&A, just remember that we're going to keep it below FOUO. For the new folks here, RSI's job is to inculcate a common understanding of the Russian strategic decision-making and way of war. And we do so to minimize any risk of miscalculations through the department. And generally, to quote General Walters, we are here to help generate peace. Now, when I first arrived at RSI a little less than a year ago, I really wasn't sure how to view this Russia problem set. And I knew that I was mirror imaging the norms and values of the West onto Russia, particularly through the US. And deep down, I knew that was not the right perspective. But that all changed for me after hearing our guest speak during RSI's Russia Forum in Stuttgart back in November. And that's where I learned the word systema, which, especially if you're new to this stuff, is a foundational term in understanding what makes the Kremlin tick. But there's a lot more to that. And our guest, Brian Whitmore, is here to cover all that and more. Now, Brian is the director of the Russia program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. And before joining CEPA, he was senior Russia analyst at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, excuse me. He also worked as a foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe in Moscow and Prague, as a graduate instructor in the Department of Government and International Studies at the University of South Carolina, and as a visiting lecturer in the history faculty at Mechnikov National University in Odessa, Ukraine. You can also catch him regularly as the host of the Power Vertical podcast, which he co-hosts with Don Jensen. Their most recent episode covers past and present disinformation from the Kremlin. So I'll stop talking and turn it over to Brian. Brian, thanks for joining us today. Good to have you back, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you. It's great to see you guys again. Thank you to RSI and to UCOM. It's an honor to be addressing all of you again. As the name suggests, the spoiler, the systemic roots of Russian revisionism. What I'm going to argue here in my time is that Russian foreign policy behavior cannot be separated from domestic political arrangements, and that the conflict between Russia and the West is effectively systemic and effectively normative, and that Russia's authoritarian kleptocratic system predisposes Moscow toward a revisionist foreign policy. Now, the reason for all of this is that I do think there's a lot of wishful thinking out there that we effectively have a Putin problem, and when Putin goes away, everything's going to be just great again, like it was in the 90s. Now, I would argue things weren't so great in the 90s. But I think we effectively have a Russia problem, not a Putin problem. Now, to start out my remarks, I actually want to start with kind of light, with some anecdotal stories from my time in Russia that I think are very illustrative. And the first story takes place in 1993 when I was first in Russia. I was one of this first generation of Americans that went over after the Soviet collapse, believing that Russia was going to integrate with the West and become a Western democracy. We were all very naive about this. And around this time, I was playing the computer game Civilization with some Russian friends. I don't know if any of you remember the computer game Civilization. You have to kind of build your own civilization, balancing your resources. It was one of the more sophisticated first generation computer games. You pick a civilization, you make decisions about allocating resources, you go to war, you defend yourself. And I was noticing as we were playing the game that these Russians were just crushing me. They were never running out of money. They were never running out of armies. And I was wondering what I was doing wrong, because I thought actually I was pretty good at this game. And I noticed at one point, one of my Russian friends was typing some code into the computer. And I said, "Hey, wait a minute. Are you hacking this game?" He's like, "Yeah, of course I'm hacking the game. That's how you win." And I was just really befuddled, because I was like, well, wait a minute, that's cheating. He's like, "What do you mean cheating? You know how hard it is to hack this game? It's harder than actually playing the game." And this was a real eye-opener for me, where it would never cross my mind to hack the game. I would try to win the game according to the rules of the game. And so this was, I thought, a very, very illustrative example. Fast forward to like 1999, about 6 years later, I was no longer as naive nor optimistic as I was in those early days. And some friends of mine, some Russian friends, it was a mixed group of friends, Russians, foreigners. We had dinner. We were in St. Petersburg, and we were going out for a stroll in the evening. It was a nice summer evening. We were going out for a stroll. And I said, do we want to walk down Nevsky Prospect, which is kind of the main drag in the center of St. Petersburg, or do we want to walk down the Fontanka River embankment? And one of my Russian friends says, let's not walk down Nevsky Prospect. It's too dangerous because there's too many police there. And I didn't, this now, if you took the Brian of 1993, I would have thought that was strange to say that. It's usually more safe where the police are. But in this case, I said, yeah, you're right. Let's walk down the Fontanka because Nevsky's not safe. There are too many police there. Now, what happened between 1993 and 1999, between these two anecdotes, where I had been working in Russia in various capacities, in academia, in the NGO sector, in media. And in this time period, I noticed a bunch of things. I noticed that, for example, legislatures passed laws that were not followed and that were meaningless. I discovered that official titles bore no relationship to how powerful somebody was. What really mattered was what clan they belonged to. And I learned the most important word in the Russian language, the word krisha, which in Russian means roof, literally roof, like a roof on a house. But in the figurative sense of the word, it means your cover. It means that you have somebody who protects you. It's your protection. Who's your krisha? What clan are you in? What's your krisha? This matters more than if you're a deputy minister or a governor or a mayor or a member of parliament. Whose clan are you in and who's your krisha? I learned that criminal investigations had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with political power struggles. And I learned that organized crime groups were effectively adjuncts of the state. I learned effectively that Russia, the way Russia works politically, bears absolutely no resemblance to the way Western societies work. And over time, I came to realizing that understanding this was essential to understanding Russian foreign policy. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And effectively, I learned that we effectively have a normative conflict here between Russia and the West. As Russian relations with the West and with the United States deteriorated, I increasingly began to look at this conflict as a normative conflict. We have, you see on the left hand of the slide, the Western system, right? All of these things that we hold near and dear, that we learn in civics class, and that we believe. And we may not always live up to these values, but these values make up the foundation of our Western societies, that it's based on institutions, accountability, transparency, the rule of law, the sanctity of contracts, individual rights. In effect, we play by the rules. Now, this is contrasted to what the émigré Russian political scientist Elena Ledeneva, in her, what I think, classic book, Can Russia Modernize, calls the Russian systema. Systema is effectively just the Russian word for system. But the way Professor Ledeneva uses it and the way I like to use it analytically, I think it takes on a whole different meaning than just a Western translation of the word systema. The Russian systema is based on patronage, patron-client relationships, networks of influence, sanctioned kleptocracy, Potemkin institutions, unwritten rules and codes, and personalized and arbitrary rule. Effectively, if the Western system is all about playing by the rules, the systema is about playing with the rules. And I want to kind of dive into just a couple of these things to talk about them. I started with patronage, and in the first, in my introduction, I introduced this Russian word krisha, which is really important. This word was very popular in the 90s for businesses when they had to get basically an organized crime protection racket to cover you to make sure your business wasn't firebombed or you weren't shot. So everybody had a Krisha from an organized crime group. By the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, a new twist on this term came in called Goskrisha, Государственная Krisha, or state Krisha, or state cover. And this term, we all learned, kind of permeated the entire Russian political system. Everybody was a member of some political clan. Every one of those clans had a powerful patron. That patron was everybody's Krisha. And that politics was effectively a battle of these networks of influence or clans. And within this battle, you had sanctioned kleptocracy. Effectively, corruption was legalized with a catch. Corruption was legalized as long as you were loyal to whomever the dominant clan was. And if you fell out of favor with the dominant clan, then you could be subject to criminal prosecution. It had nothing to do with the fact that you stole. Everybody stole. It had to do with the fact that you fell out of favor politically. Potemkin institutions, this is one of my favorites, because if you look at Russian politics on the surface, it has all this stuff that that Western systems have. You got a parliament, you got a cabinet, and you got a president, you have courts. But these things are just, they exist only in form, and their content bears no relationship to the content we expect out of such institutions. And I want to cite briefly from the late Professor Edward Kennan of Harvard University, from what I think is his classic 1986 monograph, Muscovite Political Folkways, which was about the medieval Muscovite court. And Professor Kennan writes that Muscovite court culture was marked by extreme forms of ceremonial camouflage and secrecy, and the assiduous production of noise, in which the realities of an informal corporate and oligarchic political system were masked by a facade of complex protocol, hierarchic nomenclature, and ecclesiastical trappings elaborated with great inventiveness and false circumstance. Professor Kennan was writing about how the 15th century Muscovite court resembled the courts of Europe in form, but in fact, not in substance. So effectively, we have this normative struggle, these two normative systems facing off against each other on the Eurasian landmass right now. And I think this needs to be understood whenever we talk about normalization with Russia, because I don't think Russia is going to revert to some norm that is acceptable to us, in which it's not going to be revisionist until this systema is uprooted and changed. So with that, I'd like to go to the next slide, if I may. Yeah. This is a popular question right now. Are we in a new Cold War? I think it's a largely semantic argument. I mean, my great colleague Edward Lucas actually wrote a book called The New Cold War, in which he convincingly argues that we are. And I would argue that the answer to this question is both yes and no. We are not yet at least, in a militarized conflict between two hermetically sealed blocks like we were between 1945 and 1989-91. That is not happening right now, right? Then we had the Fulda Gap. Today we have the Suwalki Corridor, or the Suwalki Gap. But we are not in this military standoff. But like the Cold War period, I would argue that we are in a conflict, as I noted earlier, between two normative systems. But unlike the Cold War, where these systems were hermetically sealed, right? Soviet communism on one side and Western liberal democracy on the other, hermetically sealed against each other and faced off in a military standoff. This time, we're integrated. You have Russian capital in the Western financial systems, for example. You have Russian media in the Western information space, and vice versa. to a degree. You have Western capital and Western media to a lesser degree than you used to in the Russian space. So unlike in the Cold War, these are not hermetically sealed. They're integrated, and actually this is really important, I think, from a security perspective. Because in the 90s, myself and others naively believed that it would be Western values that spread around the world on the backs of globalization, right? And to a degree they have. But what we've also learned is that the values of Sistema, the illiberal values of Sistema, have also been able to spread west on the back of globalization. So we have this normative conflict happening in an integrated and globalized world. It's a very, very, very different form of Cold War, and I'm even reluctant to call it that because of all the semantic arguments you get into about that, which I think are effectively useless. We have a normative struggle, and we have a normative struggle in a globalized, integrated world, and that raises a lot of questions for security and defense going forward. I mean, part of it is that what it means is that the concept of defense and security does actually need to be expanded beyond the defense arms of governments. This is becoming increasingly a job for law enforcement and for regulatory agencies and for finance ministries. And I'll get into that a little bit as we move forward. So yeah, we have this conflict between, I guess, rule of law land versus kleptocracy land, and between the Western system of liberal democracy and the Russian Sistema. Next slide, please. This is my new Cold War map. It is effectively a copy of Transparency International's corruption index. The lighter colored countries are the least corrupt and the darker colored countries are the more corrupt. What's remarkable is how much it resembles if you leave South America out of it in the Southern Hemisphere, if you look at the Northern Hemisphere, it's remarkable how much it resembles the old Cold War maps that we grew up with in the 60s and 70s. On the left-hand side, you'll see a tagline there that anybody that knows me is probably smirking or grinning or rolling their eyes. And I will say I don't blame you because I say this all the time. I rarely speak publicly without sliding this in there, and I do it for a reason, because I believe it's true. Corruption is the new communism. Now, I say this a lot. What do I mean by this? Corruption, as I noted earlier, is not a bug in the Russian political software. Corruption's a feature. Corruption is used domestically in this form of sanctioned kleptocracy to keep the elite in line, to keep the elite under control. Officials are permitted to seek rents and to monetize their official positions as long as they are loyal. And this makes them vulnerable to prosecution if they are not loyal. Now, in a globalized world, all of this black cash isn't going to remain kind of inside of Russia. It's going to move west, right? It's going to seek safe harbors abroad. And in this process, it corrupts Western institutions, and the Kremlin is not ignorant of this fact. And in fact, this has been largely weaponized. So when I say corruption is the new communism, I basically say a system based on corruption is naturally going to find transparent liberal democracies on its borders threatening. And therefore, it's going to try to corrupt them. Just as a network of communist parties and front groups once advanced Moscow's interest abroad, today a web of opaque front corporations, murky energy deals, complex money laundering schemes are going to ensnare foreign elites and create a ready-made lobby for the Kremlin. And I want to revert back to a very good 2012 report by Chatham House, in which James Green, who's an excellent Russia watcher, described this process as, quote, an extension of Putin's domestic political strategy of using the carrot of corruption and the stick of compromat to establish patron-client political relationships. According to James Green, by broadening his approach to the corrupt transnational schemes that flowed seamlessly from Russia into the rest of the former Soviet space and oozed beyond it, Putin could expand his shadow influence beyond Russia's borders and develop a natural captured constituency in the West. And I could give examples of this, naming former German chancellors by name. I won't insult your intelligence by doing that. But this is how corruption needs to be looked at as a national security issue, in this sense. And this kind of gets into a lot of where I believe that we need to bring in law enforcement and finance ministries and regulatory agencies much tighter and deeper into the national security discussion. So this is kind of the big kind of globalized picture I'm looking at right now. What I want to do is now go back into the 1990s and into Russia and talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of what was going on in Russia in the 1990s, and I guess this is a good opportunity to go to the next slide, please. To go back into the Russia into the 1990s, because I think it's very instructive. Why is it instructive? Well, first, to understand what we have come to call hybrid war or nonlinear war, terms, again, I don't like to use a lot because we get into all sorts of semantic arguments about what we mean by them. I do think it is instructive to look at the domestic political environment in Russia in 1990s, because many of the political tactics that were used by the various clans in Russia in the 90s against each other are actually things that are now being turned externally against the West and used against an unsuspecting world. The second reason I think the 1990s are instructive is that this is the world in which Vladimir Putin cut his political teeth. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I want to point out the gentleman on the right-hand side of this slide. I assume everybody knows who this is. This was one of the most famous corruption scandals of the 1990s. This is Yuri Skuratov, who was the prosecutor general of the Russian Federation during Boris Yeltsin's presidency. And when in the late 90s, in 1998, Skuratov became kind of a household name for reasons nobody would want to become a household name, when a video of him or a person resembling him, and because the Russian media would always refer to человек, который похож на Skuratov, a person who resembles Skuratov, with a prostitute. This was on the news every evening of what appeared to be Skuratov with a prostitute, and there was a big corruption scandal about what's the prosecutor general doing with a prostitute. This gets into this first Russian word, kompromat, which is the top word right under the back to the 90s there. This was a classic case of kompromat. Skuratov was investigating Boris Yeltsin's inner circle for corruption. Now, Skuratov wasn't investigating Yeltsin's inner circle for corruption because he was a good, honest guy. He was investigating Yeltsin's inner circle for corruption because he had basically joined a rival political clan led by the prime minister, Yevgeny Primakov, and the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, who were challenging the Yeltsin clan for power. So the Yeltsin clan responded with kompromat against Skuratov, and you had this whole case of the человек, который похож на Skuratov, the person who looks like Skuratov, with a prostitute. I think it's very instructive, the person who was behind that operation, the person who went on television and said that, yes, he had verified that video, and in fact, it was the prosecutor general who was with a prostitute, and we need to investigate this as a criminal matter. That person was this obscure former KGB general who had just been appointed head of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, a man by the name of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So this is an example of compromat, one of these weapons that was used by the clans in the 90s and is now being turned on an unsuspecting world. The second example I have there is the word zakazuka, which effectively means material that appears in the media that was effectively made to order. Zakazuka comes from the Russian word zakaz, to order. And this reminds me of a story, again, from my time in the 90s in St. Petersburg, when you had this reformist speaker of the city council, a man by the name of Yuri Kravtsov, who was attempting to kind of create kind of good process-oriented governance in St. Petersburg at the time, right? And this naturally bumped into and cramped the style of the criminal industrial groups that were dominating the city. And suddenly an article appeared in one of the main St. Petersburg dailies saying that he had illegally used public funds to renovate his bathroom and his toilet. And none of this was true. But there were stories in the paper about he had this elaborate gold-plated toilet in his apartment that was the state funds were used to pay for. Now, the effect of this was the end of this man's political career. He was never prosecuted because none of this was true. But the entire city associated his name with a toilet, which is actually not really great for your political future. So this is an example, again, of compromat and zakazuka. These are tactics used by Russian clans. This is just, and I'm just citing a couple of examples. These things were a daily occurrence back then. The third is actually a military term, maskirovka, which means diversion, diversionary tactics. But maskirovka was actually used in the political space too. And the illustration of this term, what I'm reminded of, is the 1998 St. Petersburg legislative elections, when you had a slate of candidates running under Mr. Kravtsov, who is discredited with this, these stories about toilets, that were, basically devoted to creating a kind of reformist model. And as a journalist at the time, I was covering them and I was deeply sympathetic to them, right? Now, maskirovka is an example of maskirovka is that each of the districts that these reformist political candidates were running, some very clever political operative found about 10 people, between 5 and 10 people with the exact same name to run against them in their home districts. So you had a bunch of incumbent perestroika era reformist liberal legislators running for re-election in 98. And lo and behold, each of them were running against about 5 or 6, 7, 8 people who had their exact same name, which doesn't really do much to increase your vote total, because obviously voters are confused. And if they want to vote for the Leonid Romankov in District 10, and there's like 10 of them on the ballot, well, that's going to decrease your vote total and help the candidate who's running against you. So this is an example of maskirovka, or diversionary tactics. And finally, zakaznoye ubийство, or contract killings, assassinations. These things were a staple of 1990s Russia and St. Petersburg in particular, where I lived, where there were so many assassinations, I lost track of them. The three ones that really stick the most in my mind were the 1998 assassination of Mikhail Manevich, who was the deputy governor of St. Petersburg, the 1998 assassination of Galina Starovoitova, who was a human rights activist and State Duma deputy, and the 1999 assassination of Pavel Kapish, who was an oil executive, who was killed with a rocket-propelled grenade on the University of Embankment in front of St. Petersburg University while classes were in session. This was the world. Now, this is the world that Putin cut his teeth in. These tactics, Putin was knee-deep in all of this stuff. Russia in the 90s was a world in which organized crime, corruption, and finance were deployed by various clans to advance their political objectives. It was a world where fake news, disinformation, and manufactured scandals were regular staples. And it was a world where assassinations were legitimate tools of political struggle. It It was a world where the line between organized crime and legitimate governance was very, very, very thin indeed. Next slide, please. And this is the world where Vladimir Putin basically cut his political teeth. Because if you think genealogically speaking, and that's the Putin on the left-hand side of the screen, genealogically, Putin is a product of Yuri Andropov's KGB, which he entered as a young man in the mid-1970s. But sociologically speaking, Putin is a product of the gangster capitalism of the 1990s that I described in the previous slide. If his worldview was formed in the KGB, his operational code was formed in these Darwinian conditions after the Soviet collapse. So it's effectively, the way I like to describe Putin, and hopefully this will be the title of a book I write someday, it is the spook meets the Godfather, effectively. Now, as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in the 1990s, in that world I described in my previous slide, Putin's official title was the deputy mayor in charge of foreign economic contacts. He was in charge of foreign investment. That was his official job. His real role, though, and this has come out I saw it in my own journalism in the 90s, but it's come out in the late Karen Dawisha's great book, Putin's Kleptocracy. His real job was to facilitate relations between the local government and the main organized crime groups that dominated St. Petersburg at the time. There were initially three of them, the Tambovskaya Gruporovka, the Kazanskaya Gruporovka, and the Malashevskaya Gruporovka. These were effectively merged into the Tambovskaya Gruporovka when the Tambov gang basically took over. And in the 90s at this time, there were really two big political figures. The mayor was Anatoly Sobchak, but everybody that really knew the city knew there were basically two powers in the city. Putin and the head of the Tambovskaya Gruporovka, a man by the name of Vladimir Putin, who is now basically in jail because Putin needed him to be silenced. Putin effectively facilitated the Tambovskaya Gruporovka's takeover of the fuel distribution and gaming industries in St. Petersburg. He facilitated foreign travel for known gangsters, security at the famous Ozero Dacha cooperative where Putin spent a lot of his time was provided by a Tambov-tied security company. So this is the socialization that Putin carried with him to Moscow when his meteoric rise began in the late 1990s. He began in the late 90s and 96 as a basic Kremlin functionary, was soon promoted to FSB director, ultimately prime minister and president, and we all know the rest of the history. Now, I bring this specific example of Putin up for a reason. I said earlier on, we have a systemic Russian problem, not a Putin problem. But the Russian systema manifests itself in different ways with different leaders at different times, right? The Russian systema under Boris Yeltsin was a very balkanized, diffuse, sanctioned kleptocracy that was very chaotic. The Putinized systema is a very centralized one. So Russia's systema manifests itself differently with different rulers. This is how it manifests itself with Putin. Now, there's a lot of mythology that Putin supposedly ended the gangsterism and the corruption of the 1990s. Remember when he was running for president the first time, he said he was going to create a dictatorship of law. He didn't do this. He didn't end the gangsterism and the corruption. He centralized it. He centralized it and he effectively weaponized it. Putin effectively cut a deal with organized crime. And my good friend Mark Galeotti, author of the book The Vori, can talk much more lucidly about this than I can. But my understanding of how this deal worked was that Putin effectively said to organized crime leaders, you do your gangster stuff, but you keep it hidden. You don't embarrass me and you don't embarrass the state. No more like assassinations on the university embankment with rocket-propelled grenades in the middle of the day. But you do your gangster stuff, I'll leave you alone. You don't embarrass me. But someday I'm going to need a favor. Someday I'm going to need you to do things that I want my fingerprints off. And as we saw this could include assassinations abroad. This could include smuggling weapons into the Donbass, for example. This can include a lot of things. So Putin cut a deal with the mafia. Putin also cut a deal with the elite. You can steal, but you stay loyal, right? So effectively, Putin utilized all of those tactics that I talked about in the last slide and more against the opposition, against his political enemies domestically. But then later he turned these tactics on an unsuspecting world. And this became what a lot of people have come to call, hybrid warfare. This use of disinformation, this use of diversionary tactics, this use of weaponized corruption and weaponized organized crime. My favorite example of the use of weaponized organized crime is the cigarette smuggling ring in eastern Estonia that became known to the public in 2015 when an Estonian law enforcement officer by the name of Eston Kochver was kidnapped by the Russians on the Estonian side of the border and brought into Russia and accused of espionage. Mr. Kochver was investigating a cigarette smuggling ring that was being run by organized crime groups in eastern Estonia with the assistance of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. And this looked at first glance just like run-of-the-mill corruption and smuggling. The FSB was facilitating a cigarette smuggling ring and taking a kickback. What really was happening was that the cigarette smuggling ring was working hand in glove with Russian intelligence, surveilling the Estonian border and providing reports to the Kremlin, to the FSB on this, and that a lot of the proceeds from the cigarette smuggling ring were being turned over to the FSB into what the Russians call chornaya kassa, or the black cash box. They effectively were being used to create black cash, untraceable black cash, that could be used for all sorts of operations the Kremlin doesn't want its fingerprints on. And that's just an example of how the Putin's Kremlin has weaponized organized crime in this particular manifestation of Sistema. And let's go to the final slide now. All of this makes me think that, much has been talked about the concept of Russian strategic patience, right? This idea of wearing the West down by raising the costs for the West. And all of these tactics and this kind of conflict between Sistema and Western liberalism puts a whole new twist on this idea of Russian strategic patience, that they can effectively wear us down. And it creates kind of, I think, a very deadly form of strategic patience, because by using weaponized corruption this way, unlike communism, for all its faults, and they were legion, at least communism was playing to some kind of higher ideal, in human nature. I think it was a very flawed idea of that higher ideal, but it was playing to a higher ideal. Corruption plays to the most basest and one of the most powerful human instincts, and that is greed. Right? So this creates a very dangerous situation, and the United States and its allies need to respond with a very kind of expanded concept of security, of hybrid containment or holistic containment, a containment that looks at how do you contain weaponized corruption? How do you contain weaponized organized crime? How do you assess threats in this globalized world that is integrated? And I know I've talked longer than I've already intended to, so I see Phil smiling at me. I'm gonna stop now, and I can get into a lot of that in the Q&A, which I hope I've left enough time for.
Brian, that was awesome. Thank you. And it's almost Hollywood-like in its proportions. Just the unrealness of it all. You had me at rocket-propelled grenade earlier on. We do have some questions, and we got the published 18 minutes remaining. So what I'm just going to do is start with a question from Ken. You mentioned Sobchak. I apologize for the names here.
Uh-huh.
Is Ksenia still a viable candidate with or without Navalny?
I mean, my short answer is I don't think so. There was a lot of arguments and discussions around Ksenia Sobchak's, who is the daughter of Anatoly Sobchak, just to give some context to the audience. Anatoly Sobchak was the mayor of St. Petersburg, one of the first generations of Russian Democrats, professor in the law faculty. Putin was his deputy mayor. He was Putin's law professor at Leningrad State University. Ksenia Sobchak is his daughter, and his daughter was a candidate for president in the last presidential elections in 2018. And there was a lot of debate about whether this was a Kremlin, this was an example of Kremlin pokazuka, basically that she was a fake candidate to give the illusion of a real election. And I believe that was certainly the case. I went back and forth in terms of thinking that she was playing some kind of a game with Navalny that would kind of create some kind of narrative in society. Upon looking back at it, I do not think that she was a viable candidate. I do not doubt Ksenia Sobchak's sincerity in terms of wanting a more liberal Russia and wanting an end to this systema. But I also know that she's a very smart woman, and she has to operate in the world that she operates in, and she has to live in the world that she lives in. So I think she's a very effective public speaker. But I think she knew the role that she had to play in this election, and I think she played it to a T. Navalny is a different case. I think that, and I think it's a much more complicated case, because I think Navalny is the real deal in terms of the opposition. But I also think that Navalny has support on the inside. Not that he's a tool of people on the inside, but I think that there are people on the inside that feel that sooner or later this thing is going to come crashing down. And when it does, we're going to need somebody on the other side of the ramparts to talk to. And so I think Navalny is playing that function of being kind of an insurance policy for a lot of people inside the Putin regime. And I think that does not in any way diminish Alexei Navalny's sincerity in his anti-corruption campaign and in his desire to create a more pluralistic Russia. One thing that concerns me about Navalny, of course, is his nationalism. Navalny's liberalism stops at the Ukrainian border. And I think that's something we all have to bear in mind. And I think we need not be Pollyannish that a President Navalny in the future would not to believe that he would not pose a geostrategic challenge to the West. So I guess I hope that addresses that question.
It certainly does, and what an attractive play to have that kind of insurance policy if you're going for a change in leadership there. So thank you, Ken, and thank you, Brian, for that answer. Next one is from Kirsten, who asks, in the Soviet era, people had to work around communist rules in order to survive. How much of the current corruption level is a carryover from the survival mentality of living in a communist economy? How much is capitalist-driven greed?
Well, I think you're right to point out that the Soviet economy, it was effectively the black market economy that kept the Soviet economy afloat, right? The black market economy was the only real economy in the Soviet Union. And people needed to operate in this system in order to survive. And yes, that certainly does carry on over into this day. I mean, you have to, I had a friend in Petersburg who had an older brother who was a traffic cop. And he was one of these weird things. He was actually an honest traffic cop. He wouldn't take bribes, right? And he got fired. He got fired for not taking bribes. I mean, that wasn't the official reason for him being fired, but he got fired for not taking bribes because he was costing his superiors money. Because the way the system worked is the cops on the street collected bribes and then kicked it upstairs. And this was this whole alternative pay system. And by not doing his part for the team, He was depriving people of their livelihood. So by being an honest cop, he was fired. Because you can't be an honest cop. You have to be corrupt. Because the state wasn't paying you enough. And in order to put food on the table, you had to have corruption. Now, this is an example of how it works. And to fight against that system is extremely difficult. The Russian economist Konstantin Bodovoy, who is currently living in California, once said in the 90s, I thought this was one of my favorite quotes in Russia, and then I said, if I invented a machine that could turn the tap water in my sink into money, I would still be broke, because the corrupt system would take everything from it. To answer your question, yes, I think this is a carryover from the Soviet system, but the Soviet system was a carryover from the imperial system before that, and the imperial system before that was a carryover from medieval Muscovy, right? And I think this is what gets into one of the kind of intellectual problems that people like me have when looking at this, is you do not want to kind of fall into lazy determinism, to say that Russia has always been like this and it always will be like this and it's deterministic. But you also don't want to fall into lazy relativism. And like, oh yeah, there's corruption there, there's corruption here, there's corruption everywhere. This is fundamentally different. Corruption that is effectively a central part of the system and is necessary to survive is very different from a system where you have corruption, it gets rooted out by the rule of law, and it doesn't get eradicated, it still exists. These are fundamentally different things. But to operate inside this Russian system is very difficult. It ages you. I mean, I spent 7 years in Russia. My friends and I used to joke that we aged in dog years. You know, in Russia, my hair wasn't as gray before when I arrived there as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, guy in his early 30s. I mean, it gets to the point where this all becomes normalized. When I was working for an NGO in the early 90s, and we filled out our expense reports, one of my friends was filling out a receipt, and it was for a bribe, and he wrote bribe. And this got back to head office in the US, and our supervisor was like, what the hell are you doing here putting bribe? He's like, well, that's what it was for. He's like, write something else, write administrative expense. I mean, because we did have to have these discussions that, how do we get compensated for, you can't get anything done and you don't want to violate the Corrupt Practices Act and things like that. So it became a very difficult thing to navigate. So yes, this is a carryover from how people survive. I mean, Russians have very finely tuned survival instincts to survive in this system.
Wonderful, Brian. I always get a kick out of how you weave in your personal experiences over there into your answers. But this next one is from Jim, and it carries on the theme of corruption. And given the current environment of corruption and Kremlin insecurity in Moscow, it seems to discourage entrepreneurship, both Russian and from aspiring immigrants. Do you feel that there is a significant brain drain from Russia, especially among the youth? And if so, how long can Putin withstand without limiting measures?
I mean, I think there is certainly a brain drain. I mean, I personally know so many Russians that have, that are here in Washington, or I knew them in Europe. And I guess this gets into almost a structural thing, because the Russian system is basically based on oil and gas, right? It's based on hydrocarbons and to an extent weapon sales. But this is a highly centralized monopolistic system. And every economist in Russia, every smart economist will tell you the Russian economy needs to diversify. It needs to encourage individual entrepreneurship. Right? It cannot continue this way because the future of hydrocarbons, as we all know, is limited, right? As we move to a greener world, but also that hydrocarbons are if you base your economy on commodity prices, you're subject to these boom and bust cycles right now, and the Russian economy is suffering. So every single economist that has any idea what he or she is talking about will tell you that Russia's economy has to diversify. It has to decentralize. It's the only way forward. But what is necessary from an economic point of view is impossible from a political point of view. Because if you diversify the Russian economy, if you decentralize the Russian economy, you're going to create alternative centers of economic power, right? You're going to have Russian versions of Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg. Well, you actually had a Russian version of Mark Zuckerberg, Pavel Durov. Pavel Durov was the creator of Kontakte.ru, which is basically the Russian Facebook. And Pavel Durov no longer lives in Russia. He emigrated. He lives in Europe, right? He actually advertised on social media, I'm an entrepreneur looking for a country. I will go to a country that taxes me fairly and is governed by the rule of law. Right? So this is what happens to a Russian entrepreneur. If you decentralize and diversify the economy, you're going to have independent centers of economic power that turn into independent centers of political power. So it will lead to greater pluralism. And this is unacceptable. So the authorities know they have to diversify for economic reasons, but they can't diversify for political reasons. And this is the paradox of modernization for Russia. And as a result, yes, you're going to keep having a brain drain, because the Pavel Durovs of Russia are going to take their considerable entrepreneurial talent elsewhere. And you, as I watch, I marvel at Russian emigres here in the States and in Europe at their entrepreneurial skills. You have to think that Russia is really, really losing as a society by not having these people, and this is going to be a problem going forward. But I don't see an out until the regime gets over its fear of decentralizing the economy. But that means dismantling, again, back to my favorite word, sistema. And sistema is very, very, very powerful. This thing has lasted for centuries. So yeah, there is a problem with the brain drain going forward, to be sure.
Fantastic. Brian, we have time for one more question, but I want to let the audience know that for those of you who have asked a question, it may not be asked here live, but we are going to try to get answers to your questions and then put up on the Project Connect webpage at a later date. This one is from an anonymous user, but it's something that we think about a lot here in the AOR. What themes in messaging would be the most useful or effective in undermining the current Russian system, in your opinion?
That's one that people in the disinfo space struggle with a lot. And I don't have a really clear answer to that, because when messaging is coming from abroad, I think it gets discredited in the Russian information space. I think that the best thing that could ever happen to Russia in terms of messaging would be a successful democratic Ukraine. A successful democratic Ukraine would create the catharsis in Russia that is needed. So I think I would even take it out of the realm of messaging and say, God, I see Ukraine as such a national security issue for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is because Russians incorrectly view Ukraine as an appendage of themselves. And they're wrong about this. Kiev was a booming metropolis when Moscow was an empty, barren forest. Okay, so Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and part of the Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom, but a successful democratic Ukraine. I was watching when the Ukrainian election was going on, and Vladimir Zelensky was running against Petro Poroshenko, the incumbent. And the assumption in Russia is incumbents don't lose. They have all the control of everything. Any challenger is not going to beat them. And Zelensky came in and ran this campaign and beat Poroshenko. But as the debate was going on, they actually had a debate, and Poroshenko, the incumbent, debated his opponent. Putin would never do that. And the Russian media was trying to play, oh, look at these chaotic, silly Ukrainians. Can't they have an orderly political, election? But a lot of Russians, if you looked at the social media, they were just watching this saying, oh my God, we are so jealous. This is how a democracy works. I'll never forget one quote on Russian social media. This guy goes, I feel like we're still in kindergarten and the Ukrainians are already grown up and dating girls. Right? So it's like, and so I think something like that, a democratic and successful Ukraine, would have just an enormous effect. A democratic and successful Georgia will have an enormous effect. I think that's where we got to focus our efforts. And by getting that message into Russia, but it will get itself into Russia. So that's how I would answer that, to be honest.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anonymous, and thank you, Brian, for that. We're just about out of time, but I do reserve a couple minutes here really quick, just for a quick question on, you're certainly steeped in all things Russia as one of our favorite Russia watchers, but for the group here, can you recommend a couple things that of late that you've read that might further the discussion, further the learning?
Well, I mean, two of them I cited. I mean, I would certainly recommend Elena Ledenieva's Can Russia Modernize? And I cannot take credit for the term Sistema, that is hers. So I want to give credit where credit is due, and that is the book that really, in a very granular way, gets into this notion of Sistema. And her argument, what can Russia modernize? Her answer is no, as long as Sistema exists. And so if there's one book that really, really, really influenced my thinking on this. Another book I cited was Professor Edward Keenan, the late Professor Edward Keenan's Muscovite Political Folkways, which is a study of medieval Muscovy, the medieval Muscovite court. It was published it was a monograph, it's a short book, published in '86. And I would highly recommend that because it shows me so much about how little has changed. It's just so, I like to periodically, it's one of these books that I go back and read at least once a year to remind myself of that. Something I'm about to pick up, I have not read it yet, but I'm about to pick it up, is my old colleague at the Moscow Times, who later joined the Financial Times, Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People. Now, what I've read, the truth told, I have not read it yet, but Catherine, if you're out there listening, it's on my bucket list, and once I read it, I've read the reviews. I don't doubt it's awesome because I remember working with you in the Moscow Times newsroom. I would highly, the reviews are great, and I trust them. And I'm going to be calling you to be on my podcast once I do get around to reading it. I would Karen Dawisha, the late great Karen Dawish's Putin's Kleptocracy. Anybody that hasn't read that, shame on you. I think you should read that. And my good friend Mark Eliotti's book, The Vori, Russia's Super Mafia, I think is by far the best treatment of Russian organized crime that I have ever read, and just a brilliantly written, compelling narrative as well. So those are just things that pop off the top of my head. I'm always coming across things, but those are the things that just kind of come to me immediately.
That's fantastic, and we're certainly familiar with a lot of those names, and enjoy the work that they produce. And Brian, I know I have certainly enjoyed this event today with you. So thank you for the hour of your morning that you've given us, and it's always great to hear what you have to say. So thank you. For the rest of the group, don't forget you can catch Brian Whitmore on the SIPA podcast, co-hosted with Don Jensen. Available pretty much on any podcast
every Friday.
Media. Every Friday.